Me and him didn't have a good relationship so much, but he talked to me. Some of the things he told me would be funny. It'd be good advice.
Wynton Marsalis.
I can't say anything about Wynton. He's a good trumpet player, but he's a good trumpet player, but he doesn't have anything extra.
What caused Miles Davis to despise someone so much? Who could earn the intense dislike of one of jazz's biggest legends? Was it a personal feud, or did it come from differences in music? Discover who Miles Davis truly hated more than anyone, and why his dislike ran so deep.
He really had this connection with the more undefinable sides of life, the things that you can't really use words to specify.
Miles Davis was one of the greatest musicians to ever live, and he knew it. "I've changed music 5 or 6 times," he once recounted. Davis was not arrogant. He was humble. To study the structure of cool jazz, hard bop, modal jazz, even hip-hop and rock is to decode his DNA. Davis was the master of social music, and for 5 decades he created the soundtrack to a life a la mode.
Would you be a musician if nobody ever heard you?
Sure.
Why?
Because I love music. It's in my head, I can't get it out.
So you listen.
Yeah.
You're hearing it yourself.
I hear it now.
Davis wasn't just heard. He was seen, stylish and suave with a stunning face to suit. But who was Miles Davis before the fame? Miles Davis was born on May 26, 1926, into a well-off African-American family in Alton, Illinois. His parents, Cleota May and Miles Dewey Davis Jr., were educated and successful. Cleota, his mother, was a music teacher and played the violin, while his father was a dentist. When Miles was just a young boy, his family moved to East St. Louis, Illinois, to be closer to his father's work. They lived in a mostly white neighborhood, on the 2nd floor of a building that housed his father's dental office. Life wasn't always easy during this time. The Great Depression hit hard, and Miles's father spent more time working, leaving him less involved with his kids.
So then they say that's where the blues came from. So I raised my hand. I said, listen, my father's rich, my mom is good looking, right? And I can play the blues. I never suffered and don't intend to suffer.
At just 9 years old, Miles got his first trumpet, a gift from his father's friend, John Eubanks. This gift changed his life forever. Soon after, he began taking lessons from Elwood Buchanan, a musician and teacher who greatly influenced him. Buchanan taught him to play in a unique way, without using vibrato, a slight shaking of the notes. Miles later said that if he used too much vibrato, Buchanan would even tap his knuckles to correct him. His mother wanted him to play the violin, but Miles was dedicated to the trumpet. By the age of 12, Miles knew that music was his passion. For his 13th birthday, his father gave him a new trumpet. With this instrument, he began playing in local bands and even took lessons from the lead trumpet player of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, Joseph Gustat. Miles loved performing and even played in talent shows with his siblings. In high school, Miles joined the marching band and entered music competitions. Though he often faced discrimination in these competitions, he felt these challenges made him a stronger musician. It was during this time that he started learning music theory, studying all he could to improve his skills. He also met his first girlfriend, Irene Berth, who encouraged him to pursue his dreams. In his teenage years, Miles began playing with a popular band called the Rum Boogie Orchestra, also known as the Blue Devils, led by Eddie Randall. He took on a big responsibility as the band's musical director, hiring musicians and organizing rehearsals. Miles later said that this job was one of the most important experiences of his early career. Around this time, he also met Clark Terry, a talented trumpet player who became his friend and gave him tips on playing without vibrato. Miles's talent didn't go unnoticed. Sonny Stitt, a famous jazz musician, even invited him to tour with a band. But Miles's mother insisted he finish high school first, so he turned down the offer, even though he was upset with her decision. After graduating in 1944, his girlfriend gave birth to their daughter, Cheryl. Around the same time, Billy Eckstine's famous jazz band came to St. Louis. The band included legends like Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker. Buddy Anderson, the band's trumpet player, was too ill to perform, so Miles stepped in for 2 weeks, playing with them at Club Riviera. This experience solidified his dream of moving to New York City, where he believed he could fully develop as a musician. Despite his mother's hope that he would attend Fisk University, like his sister, and study classical instruments like piano or violin, Miles was determined to follow his heart. In New York, he knew he could find his place in the world of jazz and bring his unique sound to the stage. This determination set Miles on the path to becoming one of the most influential jazz musicians in history.
Are black musicians genetically better than white musicians? Get me in trouble.
Not better, but they play different. White musicians seem to lag behind the beat. You know, I don't know why.
Now, the world of jazz in the 1980s had two of its biggest stars in a rivalry that many people couldn't stop talking about: Miles Davis and Wynton Marsalis. Miles, known for pushing musical boundaries, had always been bold and unique. Meanwhile, Wynton Marsalis, a young and talented musician, was quickly making his own name in jazz. However, their differences sparked a feud that shook the jazz world. Miles was known for his wild, sometimes experimental style and his habit of breaking musical rules. Wynton Marsalis, on the other hand, was only 23 when he became famous. Hailing from a respected jazz family in New Orleans, Wynton was already a master trumpeter, playing both jazz and classical music. He became known as a purist, someone who loved the classic sound of jazz and thought it should stay that way. His approach was different from Miles's, who was always trying to do something new. This created a natural tension between the two.
He's a good trumpet player, but he doesn't have anything extra. You know, he's precise.
Their mutual record label, Columbia Records, hoped that Miles and Wynton could work together, maybe even become friends. George Butler, Columbia's vice president, pushed hard to make this happen. Butler called Miles, encouraging him to reach out to Wynton, even suggesting that Miles should call him on his birthday. But Miles wasn't interested. He didn't see why he needed to be close to the young musician, and he felt uncomfortable with how much the record label wanted them to connect.
Maybe later he'll develop he'll develop another style. But as it is now, you know, he's a good trumpet player.
At the same time, Wynton was openly critical of some of Miles's choices. Miles is known for his eccentric fashion, often wearing outfits that caught everyone's attention. Wynton didn't like this. He even called them dresses. Miles didn't take these comments lightly. For Miles, music and appearance were part of his creative expression, and he didn't appreciate the young trumpeter's critiques. Their rivalry came to a head in 1986 during the Vancouver Jazz Festival. Wynton and his bandmates, including well-known musicians Jeff Tane Watts, Robert Hurst, and Marcus Roberts, were on their way to Vancouver. Along the way, his bandmates joked with Wynton about standing up to Miles, wondering if Wynton was scared to confront the jazz legend. They teased him until Wynton finally agreed to go on stage during Miles's performance. It was a daring decision that would change the jazz world. When Miles and his band were in the middle of a performance, Wynton walked onto the stage uninvited. The crowd was stunned, and so was Miles. According to reports, Miles didn't welcome the interruption. He shook his head and told Wynton to leave. However, Wynton continued to play, which led Miles to stop the music completely. The tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. Wynton eventually left the stage, leaving everyone in shock. Later, Miles explained that Wynton simply didn't fit in with the style of music his band was playing that night. Miles's music was unique, experimental, and very different from the traditional jazz Wynton preferred. For Miles, this interruption felt like an intrusion, not a respectful tribute. But what really happened that night? Each person who was there seems to have a slightly different story. Wynton Marsalis remembers things in a particular way. He says that when he got onto the stage, Davis was playing an organ, and the music was so loud he couldn't hear anything Miles said to him. When the music finally stopped, Miles did say a few words to Marsalis, but according to Wynton, he didn't use any curse words.
Me and him didn't have a good relationship so much, but he talked to me. Some of the things he told me would be funny. They'd be good advice.
Marsalis thought back to Miles's past, knowing that, at one point, Miles had trained as a boxer. Wynton, confident that he would not have to fight Miles, knew any sort of physical argument would make him look like a bully, since Miles was older and physically fragile at that point. Marsalis says that the entire incident was blown out of proportion and that people have told the story with a lot more drama than what actually happened. Also, Marsalis says he never even collected his $300 payment for that night. However, another musician, Wallace Roney, a friend and student of Miles Davis, remembers the story differently. Roney says he was in the audience that night and saw everything. He recalls that Miles had just finished a solo, and then Wynton walked up and asked, "Can I sit in?" Miles, who had his back turned, seemed surprised and didn't hear him at first. When he finally realized Wynton was asking to join in, he told him, "No, get off the stage." But Wynton didn't leave. Instead, he waited there, and eventually he started playing a solo. Miles didn't like that. After just one round of the song, Miles cut it off, stopped the music, and told Wynton to leave in strong words. Something like, "Get off my stage." People in the audience even booed Miles. Wynton, according to Roney, just said, "Fine," used a curse word, and walked off the stage. Different people have different memories of that night. Maybe the truth is a mix of both stories.
A lot of your colleagues died from drugs, from heroin. You had a heroin habit. You kicked it cold turkey and went on. How did you stop?
However, Davis went through many challenges in his life. Despite his talent, his personal struggles almost destroyed his career. Davis had a rough time as his work as a musician was slowing down, and he was barely making ends meet in 1949. He did short performances with musician Bud Powell in October and had some guest spots in places like New York City, Chicago, and Detroit. But by early 1950, he was already struggling. With little income, he started falling behind on hotel payments, and he even risked losing his car. During this time, he began using heroin, which quickly became a costly addiction. By then, Davis wasn't even 24 years old, but he felt like his life was spinning out of control. He later admitted, "I lost my sense of discipline and control over my life."
I looked in the mirror one day and I just stopped.
Davis's partner, Irene Cawthon, gave birth to his second son, Miles IV. Even though he had a growing family, Davis was in a tough place. He became friends with boxer Johnny Bratton, who inspired him to take an interest in boxing. However, Davis decided to leave Cawthon and his 3 children in New York. He entrusted them to a friend, jazz singer Betty Carter, and continued to tour with musicians Billy Eckstine and Billie Holiday. Unfortunately, his heroin use led to an arrest in Los Angeles. Though he was eventually acquitted, the incident was reported in Downbeat magazine, which made it even harder for him to find work.
Every day does it. I'm still a drug addict if I use drugs. It's like being an alcoholic. But every day it gets better. Every day, every day.
By the early 50s, Davis's skills on the trumpet were improving, and he was experimenting with new musical techniques. However, his addiction was still a problem, so he started working in recording studios to fund his habit. Sometimes he even got money by doing things like exploiting women and getting financial help from friends. His drug problem got so bad that it began to affect his music. His addiction became public when singer Cab Calloway mentioned it in an interview, which angered Davis and caused him further pain. Davis eventually returned to his hometown of St. Louis, staying with his father for a while to get away from the New York drug scene. After a few months, he moved to Detroit, where he performed with local musicians. During this time, he continued using heroin, but he slowly started to regain control over his life. Later on, he had finally quit heroin. Feeling stronger both physically and mentally, he returned to New York. Although he continued to struggle with cocaine, he was now in a better place to rebuild his career. During a recording break in 1959, Davis had a serious encounter with the police that changed his outlook. He was outside New York's Birdland nightclub when a police officer told him to move on. Davis, who was working there that night, refused, leading to a confrontation where the officer hit him with a nightstick. Witnesses saw the police hitting Davis, who ended up needing stitches for a head injury. He was charged with assault but was eventually acquitted. This experience left him feeling bitter and cynical, and it hurt his trust in people and society. He once had another tragic event that happened. While driving with his partner, Marguerite Eskridge, someone shot at his car 5 times, leaving him slightly injured.
À 4 heures, quand on s'était reposé, il est allé dans la salle de bain. Il était donc tout nu. Il m'a dit, passe-moi mon cornet. Et il a joué quelques notes. Et il m'a dit, voilà la ligne de basse que je veux faire jouer par Pierre Michelot. This is the baseline for Michelot.
Miles did not only struggle with drugs, he had a complicated personal life that was often as intense as his music. His relationships with women were marked by passion and, unfortunately, conflict. Here's a look into some of the relationships that defined his life, influenced his work, and sometimes pushed him to his limits. Miles met Frances Taylor, a talented dancer in Los Angeles.
To Miles, because I really didn't know about his music. As I said before, I'm into my ballet and all that, so I really wasn't into jazz.
After dating for a few years, they married in 1959, but the marriage had many problems. Miles often became angry and even violent. He later admitted that each time he hit Frances, he felt bad, knowing it wasn't entirely her fault. Miles struggled with jealousy, temper, and a growing dependence on alcohol and drugs, as earlier mentioned. Things worsened as he began using more alcohol and cocaine to deal with the pain from sickle cell anemia, a condition that affects red blood cells and can cause severe joint pain. This use of substances made him aggressive and even paranoid, at times seeing imaginary people in his home. After years of difficulties, Frances left him, and they officially divorced in 1968.
And the two of us, when we walked the street together, forget it. I mean, it was quite a look. They just wanted to eat us up.
Soon after, in the same year, Miles married a young model and songwriter named Betty Mabry. Betty was 23 years old, known in New York's music and art circles, and introduced Miles to new music styles like rock, soul, and funk. Betty played him records by artists like Aretha Franklin and Jimi Hendrix. Miles appreciated this new music, especially Hendrix's Band of Gypsies, and Betty's influence helped him change his musical direction. But their relationship was short-lived. Miles suspected Betty of having an affair with Hendrix, though it was never proven. They both went their separate ways. Miles then got into a new relationship with actress Cicely Tyson, who later became a big help in his life. Cicely encouraged Miles to get off drugs and focus on music again. Thanks to her, Miles was able to cut down on his cocaine use, which had heavily affected his health and career. Cicely and Miles married in 1981. However, their marriage was filled with arguments, and they split up with the divorce finalized. Miles met Joe Gelbard, a 34-year-old sculptor who taught him how to paint. This became a new passion for Miles, and they began working together on many art projects. Over time, their relationship became romantic. Unfortunately, Miles's health continued to decline. By 1985, he had diabetes and required daily insulin injections. In his final years, the medications he was taking sometimes made him more aggressive, and Joe experienced some of his violent outbursts. Miles faced many serious health issues, especially later in life. His health problems began to take a toll on him during a tour in Japan in the early 1960s, where his hip pain worsened. This pain became so bad that he needed surgery to replace his hip. During this procedure, doctors used bone from his shin to try to fix his hip, but unfortunately the operation was not successful. Miles got bored after 3 months in the hospital and chose to go home, even though he wasn't fully recovered. Sadly, he had another accident at home that required doctors to use a plastic hip joint to help him move better. By November, he had healed enough to perform again with his band. Despite his return to music, Miles's health issues didn't stop. In addition to the hip problems, he had a liver infection that kept him in the hospital for 3 months. When he was able to tour again, he chose to perform more at colleges, avoiding the usual jazz clubs and venues. Around this time, Miles's album sales started to decline, with only about 40,000 to 50,000 copies sold per release. This was a big drop from the 100,000 copies he used to sell just a few years earlier. Some newspapers also reported that he was struggling financially, adding to the pressure he was already under. To manage his pain and cope with the challenges, Miles relied on alcohol, codeine, and morphine. He also had a unique way of performing, often playing with his back to the audience, which critics didn't like. Despite these challenges, Miles's band continued to improve after their Japanese tour. However, Miles's health took another turn when he was hospitalized again for ulcers and a hernia while touring the US as an opening act for another famous musician, Herbie Hancock. Over the years, his health continued to be a challenge. He suffered from a stroke that temporarily paralyzed his right hand, making it impossible for him to play his trumpet. His partner, Cicely Tyson, took him home and cared for him. He received treatment from a Chinese acupuncturist, and after 3 months, he was able to play the trumpet again. One of the more serious scares happened in Europe. Miles was on a tour in Madrid when he suddenly collapsed after a 2-hour show. He flew back to the US to recover. Rumors about his health began to spread, and one magazine even claimed he had AIDS. His manager quickly dismissed these rumors, explaining that Miles was simply recovering from a mild pneumonia case and the removal of a benign growth on his vocal cords. In September 1991, Miles went to St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, California, for some routine tests. Doctors advised him to have a tube placed in his throat to help him breathe, as he had been dealing with pneumonia. The suggestion upset him so much that he had a stroke and slipped into a coma. Sadly, after several days on life support, Miles passed away on September 28, 1991. He was 65 years old. His death was due to a combination of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure. Miles Davis left behind a legacy of music, but his last years were marked by many battles with his health, showing the challenges he faced both as a musician and as a person.
You did a lot of bad things.
Like what?
Well, you said you were pimping for a while.
Is that bad? Is that bad?
Now we all know the dark side and some of the stories about his behavior that were deeply troubling. Now his family and estate, led by his daughter Cheryl Davis, his son Aaron Davis, and his nephew Vince Wilburn Jr., are left with a tough choice. How do they celebrate his legacy while ignoring his flaws? The Miles Davis estate controls the rights to his music and his image, but not everyone in his family agrees on how his legacy should be remembered. 2 of his sons, Miles Davis IV and Gregory Davis, were left out of the estate for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Gregory, however, didn't stay silent. In 2006, he released a book called Dark Magus, The Jekyll and Hyde Life of Miles Davis, which showed a different, more disturbing side of the man. The book describes a Miles Davis who could be cruel and violent, a man who hurt people close to him, including women. The estate responded to Gregory's book by calling it false and saying that none of it was based on facts. But was it really all lies? In his book, Gregory claims his father did terrible things, like hitting his girlfriend with a drumstick and making inappropriate suggestions to him and his wife. Some might think these claims sound exaggerated, but Miles Davis himself admitted in his 1990 autobiography that he had hit women, including his third wife, actress Cicely Tyson. He even mentioned pimping a little, which shocked many of his fans. Miles openly shared his dark side, which makes it hard to believe Gregory's stories were all made up. Despite these troubling details, the Miles Davis estate keeps promoting his image as a cool jazz legend. But the Miles Davis estate seems to want to avoid talking about the serious harm he caused others. When asked about the abuse, Vince Wilburn Jr. and Aaron Davis quickly dismissed it, saying they never saw him hit anyone. But in reality, they know what happened. They just don't want to talk about it because it doesn't fit the image they want to keep of Miles.